So chapter 2 is all about introductions and integers and introduction to solving equations. Honestly, it kind of mimics chapter 1, where in chapter 1 we kind of got introduced to whole numbers, and then we learned all the operations, add, subtract, multiply, divide. Chapter 2 is going to do the same thing, but with integers. Does everybody know what an integer is? It's positive, 0, and negatives. So we're going to introduce negatives into our computations now, where before in chapter 1, negatives didn't exist. We were just adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing whole numbers, which were all positive, all right? So the first section goes rather quickly, so slow me down if you need me to repeat anything, but it's basically just making sure you guys have an idea of what negatives are, where they are in a number line, and so forth. So nothing too exciting. Example 1, it says represent the depth with an integer. So it says the world's deepest bat colony spends each winter in a New York zinc mine at a depth of 3,805 feet. Represent the position with the integer. So basically all they're going to want you guys to do is say, how can you show that this is the depth? It's underground. It's in a mine. What do we need to put in front of 3,805 feet? A negative number, okay? So we're going to have 3,805 feet. Have you guys heard of the terms above sea level and below sea level? Okay, that's basically what they're saying. So anytime you're below sea level, you show that depth with a negative. Anytime you're above sea level, you'd show it with a positive. So the first couple first couple problems on your MyMathLab homework will just basically say, give me a number. If I'm 5 feet above sea level, you just put a positive 5. But if I'm 10 feet in the hole, you put a negative 10, okay? The next one says, okay, now that we kind of have an idea of what integers are, how do we show them on a number line? Basically, guys, negatives just count the same way positives do, but they go to the left, all right? And as you go further and further to the left, you're actually smaller and smaller numbers, which is kind of weird. So on here, let's make 0 right here in the middle. Let's label this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? That's nothing new from chapter 1. Try to write it a little bit smaller because we've got to get negatives in there. From 0, we're going to count -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. Have you all seen negatives before? Okay, so this isn't anything new. I think what this chapter will be about, since it's nothing new, it'll just be hopefully making things concrete, making you feel a little bit more comfortable with the operations with negatives. All right, so on here, guys, how does this work on MyMathLab? You basically either drag the point or plot the point with your mouse, okay? So what we're going to do is we're just going to put a dot at these numbers. So -4, put it where -4 is. -1, put a dot where -1 is. 2 is over here in the positive land, and then -2 is over here. Is that all right? Key thing to keep in mind, as you move right to left, your numbers are getting smaller. So even though -5, you think 5 is a bigger number, it's actually smaller than -4. -1 is the biggest of the negative numbers in this instance. All right. So here, you guys have seen these bad boys before, the less than and greater than symbols. Sometimes they call them the Pac-Man mouth, the alligator mouth, whatever it is. He's greedy and he's hungry, okay? So he either wants the most amount of money or the most food he can get in his bite, all right? So he's always open mouth trying to eat the bigger thing. So looking at 0 and -5, would you rather have no dollars or be $5 in debt? Which one's better? 0, right? And so then the alligator or Pac-Man eats the better of the two. Would you rather be $3 in debt or have $3? Have $3. So have the alligator mouth eat him. See how it's opening up like this? Nom, nom, nom. Okay. And last but not least, -7 compared to -12. They're both debt. You don't want either one. But if you could pick which debt, would you rather have $7 of debt or $12 of debt? 7. You got it. And so you would eat him. Is that okay? Have you guys? I used to have a teacher that would do this. Did you ever have that? The Pac-Man? Okay. So now that we have this idea of negative numbers, where they are, how they compare to positives, and how they compare to each other, they introduced this new thing, and you guys, you've all seen it before, just making sure it makes sense to you. Absolute value. What is absolute value? It's the distance from 0. So it's always positive. Why is it always positive, guys? Because distance is always positive. I don't say I live negative 35 miles away. I say I live 35 miles south, right? It's always positive. And so no matter what's inside those absolute value bars, you just ask yourself, how far away from 0 are you? Okay? It's not opposite. Sometimes people see absolute value bars and they think they have to make it the opposite of. No, it's just how far are you from 0? So let's start with A, number -9. How many units is -9 away from 0? 9 units, okay? It's just 9 tick marks away. B, absolute value of 8. How many units is 8 away from 0? 8 still, okay? So that's why I wanted to show you. A lot of people remember this, switch the negative to a positive, but then they want to turn around and make the positive negative. No, it's how far you are away from 0. So a positive always pops out. Trick question, the absolute value of 0? 0. 0 is 0 units away from itself. Are there any questions on that front page? Pretty straightforward, nothing too exciting or new, okay? The back half is just kind of starting like to creep up on you to get you used to how we're going to learn how to add and subtract these things. They are starting to talk about opposites, okay? So opposites are changing the sign, okay? Where absolute value is how far are you from 0. So whenever you see the negative outside, it means opposite of. This means opposite of. So what's the opposite of negative A? Positive A, okay? It's this whole idea of a number line. If it was a teeter-totter, what's the opposite of positive 2, guys, on the other side of the teeter-totter? -2. That's kind of the whole idea of it, okay? So they're going to give us 3 numbers, and they want us to just come up with the opposite. What's on the other side of that teeter-totter? So what's the opposite of 13? -13, absolutely, -13. What's the opposite of -2? 2. And again, they think they're tricking you, but they're really not. What's the opposite of 0? 0. So simply stating the word opposite in words is a way to say opposites and not hard. You're like, okay, opposite, just what's on the other side of the teeter-totter. But down here in example 6, they're asking the exact same thing. What is the opposite of? But instead of saying it in words, notice what they have out in front. A negative. And that's just saying the opposite of -4. The reason why -4 is in parentheses, guys, is a rule of thumb is you never have signs back to back, right? Like you can't have negative, negative. So they're just saying, what's the opposite of -4? 4. That's all they're looking for, guys. They're just looking for the number 4. If you had the number line, what would be on the other side of the teeter-totter from -4? 4. How many of you guys have seen where the 2 negatives, the teacher just makes that a big positive? Okay, that's the same idea. Whenever you have a negative in front of a negative, it's a plus, okay? But it's why that works is it's the opposite of -4. Let's look at this. The negative outside means opposite of, but we got to figure out just this part. What if I just gave you that? What if I just asked, what's the absolute value of -5? Positive 5, right? But that's not what the problem's asking, is it? It wants to know the opposite of that. So what should our answer be? Not 5, but -5. It's tricky because you want to always put a positive because it's absolute value. The absolute value part is positive, but who's hanging out on the outside? The negative. Do you guys see that? You want me to state that again? The absolute value, if that was the problem, what's the absolute value of -5? You would say 5. But what's on the outside? I want the opposite of that. What's the opposite of 5? -5. So if that was just the problem, you would say positive 5.
So when it's those 2 lines, that's when it's a
vertical,
right?
Okay? These vertical bars means absolute value. So what's the absolute value of -5? You'd say 5. But that's not what it's asking. It's asking for the opposite of the absolute value. So the opposite of 5 is a negative. That's when it gets tricky because Here, you want to say two negatives make a positive, right? But this isn't really two negatives because that absolute value is actually a positive number coming out. See, it's the exact same idea, okay? Just focus on this part first. What's the absolute value of 6? 6. But what's the opposite of 6? Negative 6, okay? So the negative comes down and the 6 comes out. So you have negative 6 there. Where this is kind of the same thing, right? The negative comes down and the 5 pops out there. They're going to try to trick you because first you see parentheses and bars. And you're like, what's the difference? Parentheses just means this number. This is the number of -4. Bars mean absolute value. You have to think positive. Yes, sir?
So it only changes when it's the vertical lines?
When it's inside the vertical lines. Yep. So see how that's inside the vertical lines there? So a positive came out. But since the negative is on the outside, it keeps it negative. Okay? That negative just kind of tags along in front and says, I want the opposite of whatever's behind me. I want the opposite of whatever's behind me. So the vertical lines pop out positive always. So if you ever have negatives in front of absolute value signs, your answer will be negative because it's a negative of a positive. They're going to try to trick you, and I know it's tricky. This is what's tricky about negatives is here you want to make it a positive, you know, because this was a positive. So let me know if you have questions on that. Does everybody see the difference between parentheses and bars?
Yeah.
Parentheses just says the number 4. What's the opposite of -4? 4. Where this bar actually means a mathematical operation, absolute value. Is that all right? Can I move on to 7? Yay, nay?
Yes.
Okay. And number 7 is kind of more practice with what we just did. So basically on number 7, guys, they just want us to make one of these, but they tell us what we have to put in, right? So they want us to take the opposite of the absolute value of a number, but they told us what that number is. What are we plugging in for x, guys? -6. Anybody brave enough to say what this answer is? It is -6. Okay? Why? Because the negative stays out. It says the opposite of, right? And what pops out of the absolute value? A 6. So -6 is your answer, okay? The negative stays out. He's not part of the absolute value, so he's just hanging out as you figure out the back part. The back part says, what's the absolute value of -6? 6. But guess who's hanging out in the front the whole time? The negative. So that's negative. He's trying to be tricky. Because you see absolute value, like it's always positive, always positive. What pops out of absolute value is positive, but if there's a negative hanging out on the outside waiting for him to come out, he will make that negative. We'll have more practice with it. All right, bars. Basically, bars can go up to represent positive, or bars can go down to represent negatives, and that's all we have to keep in mind, all right? So anytime you're above, those are positive numbers. Anytime you're below 0, these are negatives. It says, according to this bar graph, which planet has the lowest average daytime surface temperature? So which one has the lowest temperature? Do you guys agree that this is like the lowest, like the smallest number out there? So it's Neptune. It's nice and up to date. They don't even have Pluto on here, guys. So I think bar graphs are everyone's like easy. Like if the whole test was just bar graphs, you're like, yeah, straight A, right? Are there any questions on 2.1? And what we